Today, we're going to take a closer look at a murder case that took place in Pennsylvania, United States. An anonymous phone call, a mysterious female body, and a police investigation that would drag on for more than a decade. This became one of the largest and most expensive investigations in the history of the state. The case wasn't just written about in books. It was also adapted into a television drama. So, you can probably imagine just how bizarre this case became. In the early morning hours of Monday, the 25th of June, 1979, police in the Harrisburg area of Pennsylvania received an anonymous call from a man. He told the dispatcher that he had discovered a sick woman lying in the trunk of a Plymouth parked in the parking lot of a hotel in the town of Swatara. Police arrived at the parking lot at around 5:30 that morning. However, what they found was not a sick woman. It was the naked body of a woman with multiple injuries. Over the next several hours, investigators focused on identifying the victim. But once her identity was confirmed, the case became even more disturbing. Not because the victim was particularly famous or important, but because investigators learned that, shortly before her death, she had been traveling with her 2 children. Yet there was no sign of either child at the scene. At that point, police realized they could be dealing with an extremely difficult case. What they didn't know was that the investigation would turn into a battle that lasted for years. The victim was Susan Reynolds. She was born in the small town of Ridgeway, in northwestern Pennsylvania. Susan's mother was a teacher, and from a young age, Susan dreamed of following in her mother's footsteps. So, when she went to college, she majored in English. It was there that she met the man who would eventually become her husband, Kenneth Reynolds. They married in 1965, shortly after Susan graduated from college and while she was pursuing a master's degree in English at Penn State. She completed her master's degree in 1966. Afterward, Susan and Kenneth traveled around the country for several years. Then, in 1971, they decided to settle in Philadelphia. During those years, the couple had 2 children, a boy and a girl. Their daughter was Karen Reynolds, and their son was Michael Reynolds. Unfortunately, their happiness did not last. Susan and Kenneth separated in 1974 because they felt they were no longer compatible. They eventually divorced in 1976. However, it was an amicable divorce. There was no major conflict between them, and the two remained on good terms. After the divorce, Susan took the children and moved to the Philadelphia suburb of Ardmore. Every 2 weeks, she would bring the children to stay with Kenneth for 2 days. The next thing investigators needed to determine was what Susan had been doing before she was killed. According to the investigation, the last confirmed sighting of Susan was on the 22nd of June, 1979. Early that morning, Susan dropped her 2 children off at Kenneth's house. At around 8:30 that evening, she returned to pick them up. The reason was that on Saturday morning, Susan was supposed to attend a meeting in Islandtown. She had also arranged for her children to participate in a children's activity while she was there. At around 9 that night, one of Susan's neighbors saw the 2 children playing outside the house. About half an hour later, Susan drove away in her orange Plymouth with both children. And then came June 25th. Police received the anonymous call and discovered Susan's body in the parking lot of a hotel. According to the preliminary autopsy report, Susan appeared to have died from suffocation. Her estimated time of death was around 12:15 p.m. on June 24th, a Sunday. Although investigators found several items inside Susan's car, including an umbrella, a bottle of Coca-Cola, a blanket, and a massage device, most of them had nothing to do with the murder. The only item that caught their attention was a blue comb bearing the name of the 79th Army Reserve Command in Norristown, Pennsylvania. According to hotel employees, Susan's car had not been in the parking lot at any point on June 24th. It had only appeared a few hours before police arrived. But no one knew how the vehicle had gotten there. This meant that, based on the estimated time of death, the hotel parking lot could not have been the original crime scene. Susan's body had been transported there from somewhere else. At this point, investigators had almost no useful leads, but they had plenty of questions. Where had Susan gone after 9:30 on Friday night? She had supposedly been heading toward Islandtown, so why had she ended up in Harrisburg, in the completely opposite direction? Who had transported Susan's body to the hotel? Faced with these mysteries, police decided to begin with Susan's family and friends, hoping they could uncover something useful. Instead, the interviews only made the investigation even more confusing. According to her friends, Susan was extremely cautious. She did not easily trust strangers and usually kept her distance from them. She also devoted most of her time and energy to raising her 2 children. She rarely went to bars or nightclubs. For that reason, her friends were convinced that whoever killed her had to be someone she knew. They also gave investigators another important piece of information. Susan had a very close boyfriend. They had been together for several years and were reportedly planning to get married. His name was William Redfield, one of Susan's colleagues. After moving to Philadelphia with her former husband in 1971, Susan began teaching English at Upper Merion High School. William was also an English teacher. When police investigated William more closely, they discovered that he and Susan had been involved with each other since 1974. Remember, Susan had separated from Kenneth in 1974. Quite a coincidence. However, their relationship had always been kept secret. Their dates were discreet, and even their co-workers initially knew nothing about them. According to William, the secrecy was simply because he was a private person who didn't like outsiders knowing too much about his personal life. But investigators soon discovered another side of William. He was a womanizer. Susan was apparently just one of several women he was seeing. Perhaps until the day she died, Susan believed she was William's only girlfriend. So, was William the killer? Unfortunately, no. At least, not according to the evidence available at the time. William had an alibi. Two other teachers from the school, Vincent Velitis and Susan Myers, confirmed that early on Saturday, June 23rd, they had traveled with William to Cape May, New Jersey. The three of them did not return to Philadelphia until the afternoon of June 25th. William was therefore removed from the list of suspects. Investigators then began wondering whether Susan's ex-husband might have been responsible. Could Kenneth have held a grudge over her affair and eventually sought revenge? Police began investigating Kenneth Reynolds, but he was quickly eliminated as a suspect as well. The reason was simple. First, he had a solid alibi for the time of the murder. Second, investigators could find no obvious motive. Kenneth was a successful executive with a high income. His relationship with Susan and their two children remained good. Most importantly, he had remarried several years earlier, and his new wife had given birth to a baby boy just 6 months before Susan's death. And just like that, the investigation hit another dead end. Then came the first major breakthrough. About a month after Susan's murder, on the 20th of July, 1979, a Philadelphia attorney suddenly appeared on behalf of Susan's ex-husband and her brother. He submitted a statement to the authorities in Susan's local jurisdiction, asking them to suspend the execution of her will. Susan was only a teacher, but her estate was worth approximately $1 million. To put that amount into perspective, in today's money, it would be worth many millions of dollars. So how could a schoolteacher have accumulated that much wealth? Susan had purchased 2 life insurance policies from 2 different insurance companies. One was worth $500,000. The other was worth $160,000. Then, in 1978, Susan's mother died and left her a substantial inheritance. That included $200,000 in property and another $30,000 in cash. Combined with Susan's personal savings, her total assets were worth roughly $1 million. But that wasn't the most important part. Initially, Susan's 2 children were the beneficiaries of her estate and life insurance policies. But only a few weeks before her murder, she changed the beneficiaries and named her boyfriend, William Redfield, instead. Even more strangely, several weeks before Susan's death, $25,000 had been withdrawn from her accounts. Yet Susan had not made any major purchases. This immediately made her family suspicious. They contacted the bank to ask about the withdrawal. Surprisingly, a bank employee still clearly remembered the transaction. It was a large, one-time withdrawal that exceeded the normal daily limit. When questioned, Susan had explained that she wanted to invest the money in several high-profit projects being run by her boyfriend. In other words, Susan's ex-husband and brother believed that the $25,000 was now in William's hands. For investigators, William suddenly had a possible motive for murder, and the deeper they dug, the more troubling things became. Police found a large number of stocks and bonds at Susan's home, but there was a problem. Every one of them was fake. In other words, William had allegedly taken $25,000 from Susan and then created a collection of counterfeit stocks and bonds to give back to her. That amounted to serious fraud. Because of this case, William was eventually brought to court in 1980. But the biggest problem remained. His alibi still appeared to hold up, so investigators began to suspect that William may have had an accomplice. And that theory eventually led them to a second suspect. His name was J. Smith. The name may not mean much to you, but to William and Susan, Smith was more than just an acquaintance. He was their former boss. He was a former principal at Sunbury High School. There were 4 major reasons why Smith became a suspect. First, J. Smith was extremely introverted and rarely socialized with others. Yet during his time as principal, he had a surprisingly close relationship with William. Strangely, the 2 men seemed determined to keep their friendship secret. Whenever acquaintances caught them together, both men claimed it was simply a coincidence. Second, on the 19th of August 1978, Principal Smith was arrested in the parking lot of a shopping center. What made the situation particularly bizarre was that he was wearing a hat, carrying 2 handguns, and attempting to break into a vehicle. After his arrest, police found 2 more loaded handguns inside his car, along with a silencer and a large quantity of illegal drugs. Investigators obtained a search warrant for his home, and what they found there was even more shocking. In addition to more weapons and drugs, police discovered a security guard uniform. And remarkably, the uniform was nearly identical to the clothing worn by a suspect in a series of unsolved armed robberies dating back to 1977. For these reasons, Smith was brought to court and eventually convicted. But he refused to accept the sentence and filed an appeal. Then something unexpected happened. On the 25th of June 1979, Smith suddenly surrendered to authorities in Harrisburg. He withdrew his appeal and admitted responsibility for his previous crimes. From that point on, he began serving his prison sentence. If you've been paying close attention, you've probably noticed something. That's right. The day Susan's body was discovered was also June 25th, and the location was near Harrisburg. Was that just a coincidence? Third, do you remember the comb investigators found in Susan's car bearing the logo of the 79th Army Reserve Command? Before becoming a principal, J. Smith had been a colonel in the 79th Army Reserve Command. Then came another major development. The initial autopsy suggested that Susan had died from suffocation, but after blood and tissue tests were completed, that conclusion was overturned. Forensic investigators discovered a lethal amount of an anesthetic drug in Susan's body at a concentration roughly 10 times the normal dose, and Smith's home contained a large supply of the same type of medication. After hearing all of this, many people would naturally conclude that Smith had to be the killer. Perhaps William had hired Smith to kill Susan while deliberately leaving Philadelphia on the day of the murder to create an alibi. Then, once Susan's estate was transferred to William, the 2 men would split the money. Even investigators believed this was possible. But there was one major problem. They had no actual evidence proving it. And no matter how convincing a theory might sound, without evidence, it remains only a theory. Police understood this. So for the time being, their only real breakthrough was the $25,000 fraud case involving William. In June 1980, the trial for the $25,000 fraud officially began. But William completely denied the allegations. He claimed that he and Susan had never planned to marry. He also said he had no idea why Susan had told her friends otherwise. In fact, he claimed they weren't even romantically involved. He further denied ever receiving the $25,000 investment from Susan. When asked why Susan would leave her entire estate to him if they were merely friends, William said he didn't know. Instead of acknowledging their relationship, William tried to distance himself from Susan. He claimed that she was a woman who often got herself into trouble. According to him, she associated with questionable people and frequently went to dangerous places. But Susan's friends, one after another, took the stand. They testified that William's statements were lies. Unfortunately, most of their testimony was considered circumstantial and was not enough by itself to convict him. So William remained free. But those days of freedom came to an end on the 20th of February 1981. That day, police suddenly arrived at William's home and arrested him on fraud charges. The key reason for the arrest was the appearance of an important witness. His name was Christopher Pappas, one of William's friends. Pappas testified that he had been present when Susan gave William the $25,000. William didn't want to deposit the money in a bank, so he asked Pappas to rent a safe deposit box under his name. The entire amount was placed inside. 3 people had access to the box: Pappas, William, and a woman named Wendy Ziegler, one of William's girlfriends. In September 1979, Wendy Ziegler withdrew all of the money from the box. After 5 days of trial, William Redfield was convicted of fraud. He began serving his sentence in December 1982. However, he spent only 2 months in prison before being released on parole. But those 2 short months behind bars would ultimately lead him into an even deeper nightmare. On the 6th of April 1983, not long after being released, William was arrested again. This time, he was charged with conspiring to murder Susan and her 2 children. How did investigators discover this? William himself had apparently revealed it. While serving his fraud sentence, he had been playing chess with a fellow inmate named Noel. During the game, William allegedly confessed. He said that if Susan hadn't possessed so much money, she would never have had to die. He also claimed that the original plan had targeted Susan alone. The presence of her 2 children had been completely unexpected. William allegedly said he was present when the children were killed, but that he wasn't the person who actually carried it out. When confronted with these accusations, William strongly denied them, but his alleged accomplices weren't nearly as good at keeping their mouths shut. As the case began to unravel, two teachers who had previously helped William create his alibi apparently became afraid of being implicated. They turned against him. They told investigators that William had known Susan was going to be in danger before the murder occurred. According to their testimony, at around 11:30 p.m. on the 22nd of June 1979, William returned home and called Vincent and Myers, who lived in the same building. William allegedly told them that Susan Reynolds and Jay Smith were involved in a complicated relationship. He then claimed that Jay Smith was planning to kill Susan. William said he was afraid of becoming involved, so he wanted Vincent and Myers to leave town with him in order to create an alibi. The two men later confirmed this story in court. Their testimony established that William knew Susan was going to be killed before the murder occurred, but William's relationship with Jay Smith would directly affect the final charges against him. The judge eventually ordered a direct confrontation between Smith, who was already serving a prison sentence, and William. Then, in February 1985, after numerous unsuccessful appeals, William Redfield was finally convicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences. Then, on the 25th of June 1985, exactly 6 years after Susan was killed, Jay Smith, who was already serving time in prison, was brought to court and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. This time, prosecutors came prepared. They presented more than 90 witnesses and 110 pieces of evidence, but there was a major weakness. Almost everything was circumstantial. There was no direct evidence connecting Smith to the murders, and unlike William, Smith appeared to have no clear motive. Normally, when there is no motive and no direct evidence, a conviction is difficult to obtain. But Smith had incredibly bad luck because of a book. A famous crime writer named Joseph Wambaugh had followed the case for years and eventually wrote a book about it. The book was published in 1984 and was titled Echoes in the Darkness. It became a major bestseller. And in the book, the author concluded that Jay Smith was the killer. As a result, both the public and, potentially, the jury had already been exposed to the idea that Smith was the murderer. On the 30th of April 1986, Jay Smith was convicted and sentenced to death. But that wasn't the end of the story. Ironically, the same book that had helped convict Smith would later help get him a new trial. It was discovered that the author had allegedly paid $50,000 to a police officer involved in the investigation in exchange for exclusive information about the case. In December 1989, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court overturned Smith's death sentence. The reason was that the evidence used against him was largely circumstantial. There were also allegations that police had deliberately withheld evidence favorable to the defense. In September 1992, Jay Smith was released from prison after completing his sentence. William Redfield, meanwhile, died in prison from a stroke. He died on the 16th of January, 1998. The case surrounding Susan's murder was effectively closed, but clearly, it was never truly resolved. To this day, we still don't know who actually killed Susan, and we still don't know where her 2 children are. The investigation lasted more than a decade and became one of the most expensive murder investigations in Pennsylvania history. In the end, greed made this case incredibly complicated. It began with romantic betrayal, turned into a story about money, and ultimately ended with 3 lives lost. Although the case never received a truly satisfying conclusion, perhaps the passage of time has at least brought some measure of comfort to the victim's family. But what do you think? Who do you believe was responsible? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.